The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the great hall, casting a warm glow over the tables as the students of Hogwarts settled in for breakfast. Hermione Granger sat at the Gryffindor table, absent-mindedly poking at her porridge. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. A deep sense of uncertainty lingered in her chest, something she couldn't quite shake. She had never been one to indulge in rumors or idle gossip, but lately, a whispering undercurrent had swept through the halls of Hogwarts. It had started with small things, inconsequential interactions that had barely registered in her mind. A brief glance exchanged in the library. A moment of hesitation when she passed by Draco Malfoy in the corridors. But soon, things had escalated, and now it seemed every eye in the school was on her, especially those of the Slytherins. They were watching, waiting. Hermione hadn't expected to find herself in this position. She was smart, confident, and deeply loyal to her friends. But Draco Malfoy, well, he was Draco Malfoy. The same Draco who had taunted her for years, who had mocked her intelligence and blood status. The same Draco who had been a constant thorn in her side since the moment she stepped foot into Hogwarts. Yet, something had changed over the last few weeks. It had started after a strange encounter in the library. Hermione had been alone, reading up on a new charm she had been practicing. Her concentration was interrupted by the faintest sound, someone clearing their throat. She had looked up, startled, only to find Draco Malfoy standing in front of her, an unreadable expression on his face. She had expected him to make a snide remark, but instead, he had surprised her with a simple question. "Granger, do you know how to perform a silencing charm?" His voice wasn't cruel or mocking, just curious. For a moment she had stared at him in shock, trying to process what was happening. "Yes, of course," she had replied, her tone cautious but not hostile. "Why?" Draco hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other before he finally spoke again. "I need some help with it. For, something personal." Hermione had been taken aback by his request. Of all the people in the world to ask for help, Draco Malfoy was the last person she would have expected. But something about his demeanor had intrigued her. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him, something real. "All right," she had agreed, still unsure of his motives, but deciding to help nonetheless. "I'll show you how to do it." And so, they spent the next hour in the library, her explaining the incantation and the wand movements, and Draco, surprisingly, following her instructions carefully. There were no insults, no mockery, just two students, alone in the library, sharing a moment of calm. It wasn't much, but it was different. Afterward, Draco had thanked her in a tone that almost sounded sincere. "I'll, see you around, Granger." And just like that, he was gone. It had been the first of many small interactions. The next day, he had joined her at the library again, this time asking about a complicated potion she had been working on. Then, a few days later, he had sat across from her in the common room, talking about Quidditch strategy, though Hermione was certain he didn't know anything about the game beyond the basics. Each conversation was brief, awkward even, but there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread. Whispers in the halls about Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy, about their increasingly frequent meetings, about the way he seemed to seek her out. The rumors were hard to ignore, and soon even her closest friends began to notice the change. Harry and Ron had both questioned her about it, though neither had been particularly supportive of the idea. Harry had looked concerned, his brows furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. "Are you sure about this, Hermione?" he had asked. "Draco Malfoy? He's not exactly friendly." Hermione had sighed, frustration creeping into her voice. I know, Harry. I don't know what's happening either, but he's different lately. I don't know how to explain it. Ron had been even more skeptical. He's probably trying to pull some sort of trick on you, Hermione. Be careful. Malfoy's not exactly known for his kindness. But Hermione couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just that Draco had stopped being openly hostile. There was a shift in him, something she couldn't ignore. His eyes no longer held the same venomous edge when they met hers. Instead, they were more guarded, as though he was wrestling with something deep inside. One evening, as Hermione was walking back to Gryffindor Tower, she saw him again. Draco was standing in the shadows near a quiet corridor, his back against the stone wall. When he saw her, his face softened, and for a moment, she almost didn't recognize him. "Granger," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Hermione's heart skipped a beat. About what? About this. He gestured vaguely, as though encompassing everything around them, their interactions, the rumors, everything. About us. For the first time, Draco's voice wasn't filled with contempt or arrogance. It was almost hesitant. Hermione wasn't sure what to say, her mind racing. She had never expected to be standing here, talking to him, of all people. But something inside her told her she needed to hear him out. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside her. "Talk." And so, in the dim light of the corridor, Draco Malfoy finally spoke. "I don't know what's happening, Hermione. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I don't want to keep pretending anymore." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. And in that moment, Hermione realized that perhaps there was more to Draco Malfoy than she had ever imagined. The question now was, could she allow herself to see it? Could she allow herself to trust him? The following days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Hermione couldn't quite shake the conversation with Draco from her mind. It had lingered, unresolved, hanging in the air between them. What had he meant by pretending? And why had he chosen her to talk to, of all people? She had spent hours turning over his words, trying to understand what was happening. It felt like the strangest puzzle, one with pieces that didn't quite fit together, yet were undeniably connected. The Draco Malfoy she had known for years, the boy who had called her a mudblood, who had ridiculed her at every turn, was gone. In his place, a more subdued, almost vulnerable Draco seemed to emerge, and Hermione wasn't sure what to make of it. Her thoughts were interrupted during her next class, a potions session with Professor Snape. As usual, Snape's sharp gaze scanned the room, settling on students who were slightly out of line, ready to dock points for the smallest mistake. Hermione had already perfected the art of tuning out Snape's passive-aggressive remarks, but today, her focus was elsewhere. Draco was seated across from her, working in silence. His presence, while familiar, now felt strangely disarming. The few glances they exchanged were brief, but laden with unspoken meaning, and Hermione couldn't help but wonder if her thoughts were as obvious as his. After class, Hermione tried to avoid him. She wasn't ready to confront whatever it was brewing between them, especially not in front of the rest of the school. But Draco, it seemed, had other plans. She had just entered the library, her arms full of books, when a familiar voice called out behind her. "Hermione!" Her stomach flipped as she turned around to face him. Draco Malfoy was standing a few paces away, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something softer, more tentative. "Malfoy," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. She couldn't help but feel a bit annoyed by the way her heart was fluttering in his presence, a sensation she hadn't expected and didn't know how to handle. "I need to talk to you," Draco said quietly, his eyes scanning the library nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear them. In private. Hermione hesitated, unsure of what he was about to say. But against her better judgment, she nodded. All right, but it has to be quick. I have work to do. They moved to a quiet corner, out of earshot from the other students. The silence between them stretched for a moment, both of them unsure of how to begin. Look, Draco started, his voice more hesitant than usual. I know this must be strange. You probably think I'm trying to play some sort of game or something, but I'm not. I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was before. Hermione studied him carefully, unsure of how to respond. She had heard him say similar things before, but she hadn't believed him. How could she? After everything he had said and done, it was hard to just forget it all. But why? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Why now, Draco? After everything that's happened? Why would you suddenly want to change? Draco's gaze faltered for a moment, and he shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't really know how to explain it. It's not something I planned. I've been thinking a lot lately. About my family, about my choices, about you? Hermione's heart skipped a beat at the last word. You? She repeated, her voice a little breathless. What about me? Draco seemed to gather his thoughts before speaking again, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Hermione's breath catch in her throat. I've always been so focused on what my father expects of me, what my bloodline demands of me. But lately, I've been seeing things differently. You've always been so different, Hermione. So brave and smart and independent. You don't let anyone control you, and I admire that. His words were unexpected, and Hermione felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. Could it be true? Was Draco Malfoy, the boy who had tormented her for years, actually admiring her? I don't know how this happened, Draco continued, his voice softening. But I want to figure it out. I want to know who you really are, Hermione. Not the girl I've made fun of, not the person I've seen through the lens of all my prejudices. I want to know the real you. Hermione was stunned into silence. For the longest time, she had seen Draco as a symbol of everything she stood against, his arrogance, his hatred, his blood purism. But now, hearing him speak so earnestly, it was hard to reconcile this new side of him with the boy she had known. You're not making this easy, Hermione said, finally finding her voice. Why would you even think that I would want to be friends with you after everything? Draco's face hardened for a moment, as if he had expected that response. But then, almost imperceptibly, his expression softened again. I don't expect you to just forgive me, Hermione. I know I've done a lot of things to hurt you, to hurt others. But I want to change. I want to be better. Hermione looked at him, unsure of what to make of it all. The boy standing in front of her wasn't the same Draco she had known, but was it enough? Could she let go of everything she had built up inside over the years? I don't know if I can trust you, she finally said, her voice small. But I'll give you a chance. Just don't make me regret it. A flicker of something like relief passed across Draco's face, and he nodded. I won't. I promise. As Hermione turned to leave, she felt a strange weight settle in her chest. This was uncharted territory, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere deep inside, she wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Hermione had agreed to give Draco a chance, but she had done so with caution, as though treading on fragile ground that could crack at any moment. She tried to keep her interactions with him as minimal as possible, But Draco, it seemed, wasn't going to let her forget about their conversation. He found ways to subtly insert himself into her routine, sitting next to her during meals, offering help with her potions homework, even lingering near the library when she was there. Each time, Hermione couldn't help but notice the way his gaze would soften when he saw her, as though searching for something in her expression. But it wasn't just the way he looked at her that unsettled her. It was the way his presence had begun to change the atmosphere around her. Her friends were still cautious, especially Ron, who had become even more suspicious. The more Draco spent time around Hermione, the more Ron's temper flared. He had never been thrilled by the idea of Hermione and Draco talking, but now it seemed as though he couldn't hold his thoughts back anymore. "Hermione," Ron had said one evening in the common room, his voice laced with frustration, "you have to be careful. I don't trust him. You know what he's like." Hermione had tried to explain herself, but Ron was relentless. "But why? Why are you giving him the time of day? He's always been awful to us." "I know, Ron," Hermione had replied quietly, avoiding his gaze. "But he's different now. I can't explain it. He's not the same person he was before." Ron had snorted, clearly unconvinced. "You think he's changed just like that? He's probably playing some game, Hermione. Don't you see it?" It was frustrating, not being able to make Ron understand. She couldn't quite explain what she was feeling either. There was no logical reason for her to be spending time with Draco. It went against everything she had believed about him, about her own values. But something about him had shifted, and she couldn't ignore it. As much as she wanted to resist it, there was an undeniable pull whenever Draco was near. The sharp edges of his previous arrogance had dulled, replaced by an almost uncomfortable humility. But it wasn't just that. There was a quiet, unspoken understanding that had developed between them, something that couldn't be ignored. One afternoon, Hermione was sitting at a table in the library, her quill scratching furiously on parchment as she worked on an essay for Transfiguration. The sound of footsteps approaching was the only warning she received before Draco's shadow fell across her page. "You're looking a bit lost in thought," Draco remarked, a teasing edge to his voice. But there was no malice, no venom in his words. Just a quiet observation. Hermione glanced up, startled, and offered him a small smile. "Just trying to finish this essay. What about you?" Draco pulled out the chair next to hers and sat down without asking, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Same. I've been trying to avoid the Slytherin common room. Too much drama." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "Drama?" He rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't believe it. I'm starting to wonder if it's all worth it." That caught Hermione's attention. Draco Malfoy, questioning his life in Slytherin? She set her quill down, deciding to entertain the conversation. "What do you mean?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze momentarily flickering toward the door. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot, Hermione, about everything. My family, my future, all of it. It's like I've been living in this bubble, and I don't know how to get out of it." Hermione's heart softened at the words. This was the Draco she had started to see. Someone who was wrestling with the weight of his choices, the consequences of his upbringing. For the first time, she saw him as a person, not just a Slytherin rival. "Draco, you don't have to do what they want," Hermione said softly. "You can make your own decisions." He smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "It's not that simple. You don't know what it's like, Hermione. The pressure, the expectations. They don't give you a choice." Hermione felt a pang of sympathy. It wasn't a perspective she had ever considered before. But hearing Draco speak so openly about his struggles made her realize just how much of his life had been dictated by his family, by the legacy of his name. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. The library around them seemed to fade away as Hermione considered his words. She wasn't sure if she believed he could truly change, but part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people could grow, that they could evolve past the mistakes of their past. Eventually, Draco broke the silence, his voice quieter now. I don't expect anything from you, Hermione. I don't expect you to suddenly forgive me for everything I've done. But I want to be better. I want to prove that I can be. Hermione looked at him, her thoughts swirling. He was so earnest, so vulnerable, and yet there was still a part of her that felt uneasy. Could she truly trust him? Was this change real, or was it just another mask he had put on to manipulate her? I don't know if I can just forget everything, Draco, Hermione said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But I can try. We can take it slow, and you'll have to prove that you're not the same person. Draco nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet determination. I'll prove it to you, Hermione. Every day. As they sat there, the library once again felt like a world of their own, where nothing else existed except for the quiet understanding that had begun to form between them. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And for the first time, Hermione allowed herself to wonder, could Draco Malfoy truly change? Could the boy who had been her enemy for so long become someone she could trust? Only time would tell. The days that followed seemed to move in slow motion. Hermione's mind was constantly preoccupied with her interactions with Draco, and the more time she spent with him, the more conflicted she became. It was as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss of uncertainty. Ron and Harry had continued to question her about Draco, their skepticism unwavering, but Hermione had found it increasingly difficult to explain what was happening between them. It wasn't something she could put into words, not yet at least. It was just a feeling she couldn't ignore. And though she tried to keep her distance, Draco was persistent. He was always there, in the corridors between classes, offering a quiet word of encouragement when she looked stressed, or simply sitting with her when she needed a moment of peace. His presence had become a constant, and strangely, Hermione found herself welcoming it. She was no longer afraid of him, not in the way she used to be. Instead, there was something familiar about him now. Something human. One evening, as she walked to the library to finish her charms homework, she spotted Draco standing near the entrance, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He looked up when he saw her, and the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Granger, he greeted her, his tone casual, though there was a hint of something more beneath it. Hermione gave him a small nod. Malfoy, you following me now? He smirked, though there was no malice behind it. Just making sure you don't get too much work done. Wouldn't want to strain that brain of yours. She rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. You're ridiculous. I know, he replied, his smirk widening. But you like it. Hermione found herself chuckling softly at his words. For some reason, the playful exchange felt natural, easy even, like it had always been this way. But she quickly reminded herself that it hadn't. It had never been this way. There was so much history between them, too much to just erase. Have you talked to your parents about this? Hermione asked, her voice quieter now. The question had been on her mind for some time. If Draco was truly trying to change, trying to distance himself from the legacy of his family, surely he had to confront his parents about it. Draco's face darkened, and for the first time, his usual confidence seemed to falter. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his gaze lowering. No, he admitted, I haven't. I can't. Not yet. Hermione watched him, her heart aching with the weight of what he was carrying. The pressure of being born into a family that held such strong ideals, ideals that Draco seemed to be trying to reject. She could only imagine how difficult it must be. Draco, you don't have to carry this alone, Hermione said, her voice soft, filled with empathy. If you really want to change, you can. But you have to face it. You have to face your family, or else it'll always be there, hanging over you. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that, he said quietly. But I want to be. I really do. Hermione could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, she believed him. There was a vulnerability in him that she had never seen before, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about Draco Malfoy. Take it one step at a time, Hermione advised gently. Don't rush. You don't have to figure it all out at once, but just know that you don't have to do it alone. Draco's gaze softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played at his lips. Thanks, Granger. I appreciate it. It was strange, standing there, talking to Draco as if they were equals, as if they were just two people trying to figure things out. It felt right, in a way that Hermione couldn't quite explain, but there was still a part of her that hesitated. The memories of the past were too fresh, too raw, for her to simply forget them. She wasn't ready to forgive everything. At least, not yet. That night, as Hermione sat alone in the Gryffindor common room, she thought about Draco's words. She thought about his vulnerability, his attempts to change, and wondered if it was possible for someone like him to truly break free from the shackles of his upbringing. Could Draco Malfoy really change? Could he be someone who didn't just follow in his father's footsteps, but forged his own path, independent of the hate and prejudice that had shaped his life? She wasn't sure, but part of her wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that people could change, that even someone like Draco could be different. The following week, things took a turn. During a late-night study session in the library, Hermione found herself once again seated across from Draco, the soft glow of candlelight flickering between them. They were working in comfortable silence, the only sound the rustle of parchment and the scratch of quills against paper. Out of nowhere, Draco spoke, his voice low but steady. I talked to my father today. Hermione looked up, surprised. You did? He nodded, his expression guarded. It didn't go well. But I had to do it. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Hermione's heart swelled with admiration for him. And what happened? Draco hesitated before answering. He didn't take it well. He called me a traitor, said I was weak. But it felt right. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know I'm not going back. I can't. Hermione smiled, a small, proud smile that she couldn't contain. I'm proud of you, Draco. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, he admitted, his voice tight. But I'm not going to let him control me anymore. There was a strength in his words that made Hermione's heart race. For the first time, she saw the Draco Malfoy she had never believed could exist. The boy who had been swallowed up by his family's expectations was finally stepping into the light, choosing his own path. And for the first time, Hermione believed him. This wasn't just a phase. This wasn't some fleeting change. Draco Malfoy was becoming someone different. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see the person he could be. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance between change and resistance. Draco had begun to carve out a new identity for himself, but the world around him wasn't so easily swayed. The whispers in the hallways of Hogwarts grew louder, and it seemed like every corner they turned, Draco was met with cold stares or snide remarks. His decision to defy his family wasn't going unnoticed, but neither was it being embraced by his peers. It wasn't just his father's wrath he had to contend with. It was the weight of his entire house, and even the wider wizarding world, which expected him to adhere to the values of blood purity and supremacy. Still, Draco persisted. He was quieter now, his confidence more subdued, but there was a quiet strength in his actions that Hermione couldn't help but admire. He wasn't the same arrogant boy who had mocked her and her friends for years. There was humility in the way he held himself, and though his past couldn't be erased, there was a genuine effort to change. For Hermione, it wasn't easy. Every moment she spent with him, every conversation, pushed her further into a strange emotional limbo. She wanted to believe in his transformation. She really did. But there were moments when the old Draco, the one who had been her tormentor, resurfaced. A sharp remark here, a flicker of arrogance there. And it was hard to forget, no matter how much time had passed. One evening, as she sat in the great hall, Hermione watched Draco across the room. He was talking with Blaise and Pansy, his face animated as he spoke, but there was a guardedness in his posture, something unfamiliar to her. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, uncertain, vulnerable even. He had been sitting at the Slytherin table for the past few days, isolated, trying to distance himself from his former circle. Pansy had made a few pointed comments, and Blaise had kept his distance, unsure of what to make of Draco's shift. Hermione's gaze locked with his for a moment, and she saw him look away quickly, a fleeting expression of something she couldn't quite place crossing his face. She felt a pang in her chest. It was a constant struggle for him, this push and pull between the old Draco and the new Draco, between the boy he had been and the man he was trying to become. Ron's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You okay?" he asked, his tone filled with concern. Hermione looked up at him, startled. "What? Oh, yeah, I'm fine." Ron gave her a skeptical look but didn't press. He knew something was going on, but he didn't understand it, and frankly, he didn't want to. He had never been as forgiving of Draco as she had tried to be, and it was clear that their strained interactions weren't helping. As dinner continued, Hermione couldn't help but glance back at Draco. He was still sitting with his old friends, though he was saying very little. There was an odd tension in the air, and it wasn't just the normal Slytherin-Gryffindor rivalry. No, this was something different. Draco wasn't just distancing himself from his old life. He was losing it. The people he had spent years aligning himself with were slowly pulling away, unsure of his new stance. After dinner, Hermione found herself walking alone along the dimly lit corridors, her mind racing with thoughts of Draco and what he was going through. She hadn't seen him in class that day, and for some reason, it made her uneasy. She had grown used to his quiet presence, and now that he was absent, it left an unfamiliar hole in her day. Turning a corner, she nearly bumped into him. He was leaning against the wall, staring out a nearby window, his back to her. She stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to do. "Draco?" she called softly. He didn't turn immediately, as though he hadn't heard her, or perhaps didn't want to acknowledge her. But then, after a few seconds, he slowly straightened and faced her, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't think I'd see you tonight." Hermione took a few steps closer, her gaze searching his face. "Where were you? You didn't come to dinner?" He shrugged, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. "Just needed some space. Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm about to explode." Hermione frowned, concern edging her voice. "What happened? Did something happen with your father?" Draco's lips pressed into a thin line, and he shook his head. "Not exactly. He doesn't know yet. But it's only a matter of time. The longer I keep avoiding him, the more questions they'll have. It's wearing me down." Hermione stepped closer, her voice softening. "You don't have to do this alone, Draco. You've made so much progress, but you don't have to bear the weight of it by yourself." Draco's eyes softened as he looked at her, a flicker of gratitude passing through them. "I know you mean well, Granger, but it's not that simple. I can't just—" He stopped himself, clearly frustrated. "I can't just turn around and expect everyone to accept it. It's not like I'm undoing a spell. It's my entire life I'm trying to change." Hermione met his gaze steadily. "It's not going to be easy, Draco, but change never is." There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Draco said, "I'm scared, Hermione." The words were so unexpected, so raw, that Hermione was taken aback. The Draco she had known had never admitted to fear. He had always been the confident, unshakable Slytherin. But now, there was something vulnerable about him, something that reached deeper than any of the walls he had built around himself. "I'm scared I'll fail," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity. "I'm scared that no matter how hard I try, I'll never be enough. I'll never be the person I want to be. And when it all comes crashing down, I'll be alone." Hermione's heart ached at the admission. She stepped closer, standing just in front of him now, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "You don't have to be alone. Not anymore." Draco's expression softened, and he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something he wasn't yet ready to admit. But in that moment, Hermione knew he was beginning to let her in. Not fully, not yet, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, they could both navigate this uncertain path together. The days following that conversation were a blur of conflicting emotions for Hermione. She had seen a side of Draco that she hadn't expected, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about him. But as much as she wanted to be there for him, to support his journey toward change, she couldn't ignore the tension that lingered between them. There was a part of her that wanted to keep her distance, to protect herself from the potential heartbreak that seemed inevitable. After all, how could someone like Draco Malfoy truly change? Could he really break free from the legacy of his family and the dark path they had paved for him? Despite her doubts, she found herself looking for him more and more often. It wasn't that she had fallen for him, not in the way Ron feared, but there was a connection between them now, something deeper than just two Hogwarts students trying to navigate their world. It was something fragile, something that neither of them fully understood yet. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of classes, Hermione made her way to the library, hoping to find some peace in the familiar stacks of books. She needed to clear her mind, to focus on something other than Draco. But as she rounded the corner, she froze. There, sitting at a table near the back, was Draco. His head was bent over a book, his fingers drumming absently on the table as though he were lost in thought. For a moment, Hermione hesitated, unsure whether to approach him or leave. It had been a few days since they'd last talked, and their last conversation had left an unspoken tension in the air. But as though sensing her presence, Draco looked up, his eyes meeting hers in an instant. "Hermione," he said, his voice almost tentative, as though testing the waters. "You're here." She smiled faintly, her heart giving a small, unexpected lurch at the sound of her name on his lips. "I'm always here," she replied softly, walking toward the table. "I don't think I've ever missed a single study session." Draco's lips quirked up at the corner, and for a moment he looked like the Draco of old, the boy she had known and been so wary of. But then that expression faded, replaced with something more sincere, almost vulnerable. I'm glad you're here, he said quietly, pushing a chair out for her. Hermione sat down, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She didn't quite know what to say, so she decided to start with the familiar. "What are you working on?" she asked, glancing at the parchment in front of him. "Potions essay," he muttered, though his eyes weren't focused on the paper. "But it's not going well. I think I've mixed up a few ingredients." Hermione couldn't help but smile at the rare sight of Draco, looking flustered over something so simple. It was endearing, in a way that she hadn't expected. He was always so confident, so assured of himself, that it was strange to see him struggling with something as mundane as a school assignment. "You know, I could help you with that," she said, her voice light. "I've always been good at potions. My dad's a muggle, but he's quite handy in the kitchen." Draco raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Your dad? A muggle? You're telling me he can brew potions?" Hermione shrugged, her tone teasing. "Not exactly potions, but he's good at following instructions. I suppose I got my skills from him. If you'd like, I could give you a hand with your essay." For a moment, Draco simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. It was as though he were trying to decide whether to accept her offer or not. Finally, he sighed and pushed the essay toward her. "Fine. Help me before I blow up the entire dungeon," he muttered, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Hermione smiled back and began reviewing the paper. As she explained a few of the finer details, their conversation drifted from potions to other subjects, carefully sidestepping the heavy issues that had been weighing on both of them. Draco listened intently, asking questions here and there, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a simple, normal interaction between friends. Or at least, two people trying to be. But then, as they were nearing the end of the essay, Draco's expression grew serious again. His fingers drummed softly on the table, and Hermione could tell that something was bothering him. "Something's wrong," Hermione said, her tone sharp with concern. "What is it?" Draco hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I don't know. It's just..." He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Everything is changing so fast. One minute, I feel like I'm finally making progress, like I'm doing the right thing. And the next, it all feels like it's slipping away." Hermione sat back in her chair, watching him closely. She could see the internal battle he was fighting, the conflict between the boy he had been and the man he was trying to become. "Change is hard, Draco," she said gently. "And it's not always linear. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when you doubt yourself. But you can't let those moments define you. You can't let them pull you back into the person you don't want to be anymore." Draco looked at her, his gaze softer now. "You make it sound so easy. Just let go of everything I've known." "But it's not that simple, Hermione. It's like there's this constant weight on my chest, reminding me of everything I've done, everything I've been." Hermione reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his. "No one is asking you to forget, Draco. But you can learn from your past without letting it control you. You're not that person anymore." For a moment, Draco didn't move. Then, slowly, he placed his hand over hers. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight of its own, an acknowledgement, an unspoken promise. "You really think I can do this?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Hermione smiled softly, her fingers gently squeezing his. "I know you can." The silence that followed was different from the awkward tension that had once marked their interactions. Now, there was a sense of mutual understanding, a bond that neither of them had expected to form. It was fragile, tentative, but it was real. As they sat there, side by side, Hermione couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something more, something she had never thought possible. Could Draco Malfoy really change? Could he really become the person he was striving to be? She didn't have all the answers. But for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, he could. As the days turned into weeks, the uneasy truce between Draco and the rest of the school began to shift. It wasn't so much that the world around him was suddenly accepting him. No, that would have been far too simple. But Draco had made a choice, a decision to turn his back on the path his parents had set for him, and that had begun to show. Slowly, but surely, people were starting to notice. Whispers were less frequent, and the stares less harsh. Even if it wasn't much, it was progress. But for Hermione, the change was more difficult to see. Not because she doubted Draco's commitment, but because every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the gulf between who he had been and who he was trying to become. It wasn't a smooth transition, not by any means. Draco had his moments of bitterness, moments when his old arrogance resurfaced, moments when the world seemed too much to bear, and he would retreat into the comfort of the boy he had once been. Still, Hermione couldn't help but be drawn to him. As their interactions continued, she found herself thinking about him more and more, worrying about him when he wasn't around. She had never expected to care for him, much less form some sort of bond with him, but it was becoming undeniable. They were slowly becoming something more than adversaries or reluctant allies. Whether that was a good thing or not, she wasn't sure. It was late one evening when she found him in the library again, this time not reading or working on assignments, but simply staring at the pages of a book without really seeing them. His brow was furrowed, a crease of worry etched into his features, and for a moment Hermione couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. "Draco," she said softly, stepping into his line of sight. He didn't look up immediately, but she could see his shoulders tense. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. "Granger," he said, his voice flat, but with a hint of something unspoken. "I didn't expect you to come by." Hermione sat down across from him, her eyes studying him carefully. "You didn't come to dinner tonight. Is everything okay?" Draco sighed and ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "It's just too much, Hermione. Every time I think I've got a handle on things, I realize there's always something more to deal with, and it feels like it's all just crashing down on me." Hermione's heart tightened at the sight of his frustration. She had known it wouldn't be easy for him, but seeing him this vulnerable made her feel like she was on the edge of something important, something that could either heal them both or break them apart. "Draco," she began softly, "you don't have to go through this alone." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the book in front of him, but Hermione could see his fingers tightening around the edges of the pages, his jaw set in a way that betrayed his inner turmoil. "I'm not used to relying on anyone," he admitted finally, his voice low. "My whole life, I've been taught to be strong on my own, to never show weakness, never let anyone see that I'm struggling. It's how I've survived all these years." Hermione's breath caught in her throat. "But that's not you anymore, Draco. You've changed. You're trying, and that's what matters. You don't have to hide behind that facade anymore." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as though the very air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I don't know how to stop hiding," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Hermione didn't answer right away. She could feel the weight of his words settling around them, the heaviness of his past hanging like a shroud over everything he said and did. She reached out, her hand gently touching his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes in that quiet moment. "You don't have to stop hiding all at once," she said softly. "But little by little, Draco, you can start letting go. And I'll be here. You're not alone in this." For the first time, Draco's eyes softened, a faint flicker of something like hope passing through them. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was enough. "I don't deserve your kindness," he murmured, his voice thick with something unspoken. Hermione shook her head, her grip tightening on his hand. "You don't have to earn it. You don't have to earn my friendship, or anything else. I'm here because I believe in you." Draco's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could get the words out, the library doors swung open and the moment was broken. "Granger! There you are!" Ron's voice echoed across the room, sharp and loud. He was standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of relief and annoyance. Hermione reluctantly pulled her hand away from Draco's as Ron walked over, but she couldn't help but glance at Draco again. He was watching her, his expression inscrutable. She knew that Ron didn't understand. Not yet, anyway. But that didn't matter right now. Ron's gaze flicked between the two of them, his frown deepening. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone a little too sharp for comfort. "Why are you sitting with Malfoy?" Hermione stood up, brushing off her robes. She knew that Ron wasn't about to let this go easily. "I was helping him with his potions essay," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "And besides, we've had a few talks lately. He's not the same person he was, Ron." Ron crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. "I don't trust him, Hermione. You shouldn't either." But Hermione stood her ground, her eyes meeting Ron's with an intensity that made him pause. "I trust him, Ron. I think you need to give him a chance." Ron opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything more, Draco stood up, his voice cool but steady. "I think it's time for me to go. Don't want to cause any more trouble than I already have." He shot a brief glance at Hermione before turning to leave. Hermione watched him go, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure where this was heading, this tentative truce between them. But as much as Ron might object, she knew she couldn't walk away from it now. Draco had changed, or at least he was trying to, and maybe that was enough. The days following that evening in the library were filled with a quiet tension. Hermione could feel the change in the air. Ron's lingering unease whenever Draco was mentioned, and Draco's increasingly distant moments when he felt the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on him. It was as if they were all standing on the edge of something, waiting for the inevitable slip that would send everything crashing. But no one was willing to speak the words that would make it real. Draco, despite his attempts to distance himself from the past, couldn't entirely escape the legacy of his family. He had spent years cultivating the image of a proud, untouchable Slytherin, and no matter how many strides he made toward redemption, there would always be those who viewed him as the same boy who had mocked Muggleborns, who had reveled in the cruelty of his father's ideals. The whispers in the hallways were still there, the stares in the corridors just as harsh, and it wore on him. But it wasn't just the past that threatened to unravel everything. It was the present, too. The constant reminders that his choices weren't without consequence. With each passing day, Draco's resolve grew stronger. He didn't want to be the person he had once been, but how could he prove that to the world? Especially when even the ones he cared about the most weren't convinced. Hermione saw it in his eyes. She saw the fight that raged within him, the part of him that wanted to believe he could be something more. But she also saw the exhaustion, the way he carried himself like someone who was already worn out from trying to be better. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be. One afternoon, after classes, she found him by the Black Lake, sitting on the edge of the dock, his gaze fixed on the water as if lost in thought. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach him. She knew he was struggling, but there were times when he pushed her away, retreating into his own thoughts and leaving her to wonder how much of a role she truly played in his journey. But something in her wouldn't let her walk away. She couldn't. Not now. "Draco?" she called softly, her voice carrying across the quiet expanse of the lake. He looked up, and for a moment, Hermione was struck by the vulnerability in his expression. It was a look she had never expected to see on his face, the face of someone who had always worn his pride like armor. But now, he looked tired, and maybe, just maybe, a little lost. "Granger," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for you," Hermione replied, walking toward him slowly. "I thought you might need someone to talk to." Draco didn't respond immediately, but he didn't turn her away either. Instead, he just nodded slightly, his gaze returning to the water. Hermione sat down beside him, her feet dangling off the edge of the dock. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the stone, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hermione didn't mind the silence. Sometimes, it was enough just to be there, present, without needing to say anything. Finally, Draco broke the quiet. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing this," he confessed, his voice low. "I'm trying, but every time I take a step forward, it feels like the world is pushing me 2 steps back." "People don't change overnight, Hermione. They don't just decide one day to be better, and suddenly everything is different. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Hermione turned her head to look at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Draco, you're right. Change doesn't happen all at once. It's messy. It's hard. And it's not something you can do alone. But I believe in you. I believe that you can do it. I've seen you change already." Draco's eyes flicked to her, and there was a faint trace of doubt in his gaze. "You believe in me? After everything?" "Yes," Hermione said firmly. "You're not defined by your past, Draco. You're more than that. I know it's hard, but you have to trust that you're capable of more than you think." He swallowed, as though the weight of her words was more than he had expected. For a long moment, he simply stared at the water, his jaw clenched tight. It was clear that he was fighting with something inside himself, some part of him that still clung to the darkness he had been raised in, to the expectations placed on him by his family. "You don't have to do it alone," Hermione said again, her voice soft but insistent. "I'm here for you. And you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to keep trying." Draco turned his head toward her, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time in weeks, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, something that hinted at the person he had been, the person he wanted to become. A flicker of hope, fleeting and fragile, but still there. "I don't know how to make it right," he murmured, his voice raw, "but I want to try. I want to be someone different." Hermione reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm, offering him the quiet reassurance he so clearly needed. "And you will be, Draco. One step at a time." They sat in silence after that, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the world pressing down on them, but somehow feeling a little lighter with each passing second. The lake stretched out before them, vast and endless, just like the future that lay ahead. Neither of them knew exactly what it would hold, but in that moment, they had each other's trust, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. The following weeks brought a sense of quiet change to Hogwarts. The weather began to cool, and the golden hues of autumn began to settle over the castle grounds. But even as the seasons shifted, the challenges Draco faced remained constant. It wasn't easy, this path of redemption he had chosen. The weight of his past still pressed down on him. Each day a struggle between who he had been and who he was trying to become. And while Hermione remained steadfast in her support, the other students weren't quite so forgiving. Their judgment was always there, just beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to break. Draco knew it. He could feel it every time he walked through the halls, every time he entered a classroom or the Great Hall. The whispers never ceased. His presence still made people uncomfortable. It didn't matter how much he had changed. It was as though the past was an unshakable shadow, and it clung to him no matter how hard he fought against it. But it wasn't the whispers that troubled him the most. It was the distance that had started to grow between him and Hermione. They had been spending more time together, talking, studying, slowly building something that felt real. But lately, things had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a small change in the way she looked at him, the way she hesitated before speaking. She was holding something back, and it gnawed at him. He couldn't bring himself to ask about it. Not yet. Not when he wasn't sure how to put into words what he was feeling. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing exactly what he wanted. But with Hermione, everything had become more complicated, more uncertain. It was early one evening when Draco found himself wandering the corridors of Hogwarts, trying to clear his head. He didn't have a particular destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to be alone with his thoughts. As he turned a corner, he almost ran into Hermione, who was carrying a stack of books in her arms. "Oh, Draco, sorry," she said, her voice soft but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. He quickly stepped aside, giving her room to pass. "It's fine," he replied, but there was a note of awkwardness in his voice that he hadn't intended. He could see the same discomfort in her expression, and it made his chest tighten. What had changed between them? Why did it feel like there was this invisible wall slowly growing between them? Hermione adjusted the books in her arms, clearly not sure how to proceed. "I was just heading to the library," she said, her words coming out quickly, as though she were trying to fill the silence. "You don't have to follow me or anything. I wasn't planning to," Draco interrupted, but the words sounded more biting than he intended. He immediately regretted them, but the damage had already been done. The tension between them was palpable now, thick in the air. Hermione took a step back, her eyes searching his face for something. Understanding, perhaps, or reassurance. But Draco didn't know how to give her either. He didn't even understand what was happening between them. All he knew was that it felt like they were standing on the edge of something, and he didn't know whether to take a step forward or retreat. After a long moment, Hermione sighed, the weight of unspoken words heavy in her eyes. "I don't know what's going on, Draco," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something's not right. I can feel it. I don't know if it's you or me, but we're both pulling away, and I don't understand why." The honesty in her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so caught up in his own turmoil, in his own doubts, that he hadn't even realized the strain this was putting on their relationship. He had been afraid of this moment, afraid of acknowledging the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. That he cared for her in a way that went beyond friendship. That he didn't know how to keep pretending that this, whatever this was, wasn't becoming something more. "I don't know either," he confessed, his voice quieter now. "But I think I'm scared, Hermione." Her brows furrowed in confusion. "Scared?" Draco nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting hers again. "Scared of what this is. Scared of what I might be, what I might become if I keep trying to be someone I'm not. Scared of how I'm feeling about you." The last words hung in the air between them, charged with a tension that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. Hermione was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to decipher what he had just said. "Draco," she said softly, taking a cautious step closer. "You don't have to be scared. You're not alone in this. I'm not asking for you to change overnight, and I'm not asking you to be perfect." He shook his head, frustration evident in his posture. "It's not that simple. I can't just undo everything I've done, the things I've said, the things I've believed. I can't just pretend it never happened. And I don't want you to think that you can fix me. That's not fair to you." "I'm not trying to fix you, Draco," Hermione replied firmly. "I'm just trying to be here for you. But you have to let me. You have to let someone in." Draco's breath hitched at the sincerity in her words. It was as if, in that moment, the walls he had spent years building around himself began to crack. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably. He had been running from the idea of needing anyone, of needing her. But now, for the first time, he could see the truth of it. He wasn't in this alone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight of everything by himself anymore. "I don't know how to let you in," Draco admitted, his voice raw with the vulnerability he had long kept hidden. "But I'm trying. I really am." Hermione's expression softened, and she took another step toward him. "That's all I can ask for, Draco. I'm here, and I believe in you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, though it was thick with all the things they hadn't said. But for the first time in a long while, Draco didn't feel the need to flee from the moment. Instead, he stood there, facing Hermione with a newfound clarity, ready to embrace whatever came next. "I think I'm starting to believe in myself too," he said quietly. And for the first time, Hermione smiled, a small but genuine smile. And in that moment, Draco knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed brought a delicate balance between growth and uncertainty. Draco's internal battle continued, but there was a shift in how he navigated the days. No longer did he face them with the same defensiveness, the same prickly attitude he had once worn as armor. But that didn't mean the journey was any less difficult. The weight of his family's legacy, the scars of his past decisions, were not something he could simply leave behind. The ghosts lingered, just as the whispers from the students still followed him in every hallway. Yet, it was different now. For the first time in a long time, Draco didn't feel completely alone in it. Hermione's support, quiet and unwavering, had become something he relied on. They spent more time together, their connection deepening in ways neither of them had anticipated. Whether it was sharing small moments in the library, walking by the lake, or sitting in the common room in a comfortable silence, each interaction between them carried a sense of growing intimacy. But with that intimacy came new challenges, new emotions neither of them knew how to navigate. Hermione was just as uncertain about where this connection was leading as Draco was. She had never expected to be so drawn to him, to care for him in this way, and it was a strange feeling, one that made her question things she had once believed were set in stone. Yet, with every small gesture, with every conversation, she found herself becoming more entangled in his life, in his struggle. She had always been driven by logic, by reason, but when it came to Draco, everything felt far more complicated. It was one late evening when they found themselves once again sitting by the black lake, watching the moon cast its soft glow on the water. They had been here countless times before, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a shift that neither could ignore. "So, what now?" Draco asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Hermione turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the pale light. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Draco murmured. "I guess I guess I'm just wondering where this goes. What happens now that I'm trying? Now that things are different between us?" Hermione exhaled softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the grass beside her. "I don't know either. I don't have all the answers, Draco. But I do know this. We're both in a different place than we were before. And maybe that's enough for now. We'll figure it out as we go." Draco studied her face, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. It was that sincerity, that willingness to stand by him even when everything around them told her she shouldn't. That made him feel something he couldn't quite put into words. It was a sense of peace, though fragile, that settled in his chest. "Do you ever wish we hadn't gotten involved?" he asked, his voice low. "That I hadn't come into your life like this?" Hermione's eyes softened, and she reached over, her hand resting gently on his. Number never. "I know it's complicated, Draco. I know it's hard, and I know that people still don't understand, but I don't regret it. I don't regret any of it." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. They were standing at the edge of something, and Hermione knew it. Whether it was a friendship that had grown into something more, or the first steps toward a relationship neither of them had ever expected, it was impossible to ignore the change that had taken place between them. For a long time, neither of them said anything else. There was no need for words when the truth was already understood. The past was never going to be easy to leave behind, but they had learned to face it together, in their own way. Whatever happened next, they would deal with it as they always had, side by side. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Draco turned to her, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad I didn't push you away," he said quietly. Hermione smiled back, her heart light despite the complexity of the situation. "Me too." And in that moment, everything seemed to settle into place. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. They still had a long way to go, and the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges. But they were no longer standing alone. They had each other, and that was enough to face whatever the future held. With one last glance at the shimmering lake, they stood up, the silence between them no longer awkward, but comfortable. They didn't need to speak anymore. They simply understood. As they walked back to the castle together, their steps in sync, it was clear that whatever path they chose, they would walk it together.